Appreciate that. Good to see everybody tonight, as usual, and hope that discussion as we finish up James chapter 1 will be helpful, beneficial, encouraging, and as always, feel free to jump in, participate as you will. Don't hesitate to make your comments or ask your questions as we go through the discussion. We kind of left off, we fixed this to discuss those last three verses, 25 to 27, and he's contrasting the person who looks into the law of liberty, the perfect law of liberty, law of freedom, and he goes his way and forgets what he saw. He sees what needs to be done. He sees the correctable flaws, but he goes his own way and he forgets what manner of man he was. He doesn't do anything about correcting those flaws. He is classed as a forgetful hearer, and so he's contrasting that. Somebody who hears the word, knows what he needs to do, and doesn't do it, with the person who sees what needs to be done and he doesn't. He corrects, he looks into the perfect law of liberty, and he continues. And it's a really, and Barnes had a couple of really good comments on that. I'm going to read that in just a second. In other words, it's more than just a glance, it's more than just a look. It's, as it were, a deep searching of what he needs to do to make things right. He really, he bends over it, he looks at it very, very closely, rather than just glances at the mirror and so forth, as opposed to the one who just does that looks into it, doesn't do anything about it. This person looks into it, decides what he needs to do, and he does it. I wanted to, Wayne Jackson had a nice thought about it, kind of a contrast between the two. The one who looks into it, and he's contrasting the perfect law with what went on in the Old Testament, of course, with animal sacrifices and so forth. And let me just read a couple of paragraphs, won't be too long. The devout will be consistently obedient to the demands of God's word. The shallow person who superficially hears the word deludes only himself. And he talks about this in verse 22. He's like the man who beholds his reflection in a mirror, notices correctable flaws, but quickly thrusts the unseemly image from his mind, leaving himself unattended. In other words, he does nothing about it. That's in verses 23 and 24. By way of contrast, the one who carefully examines the perfect law, which bestows liberty, namely the gospel, the new covenant, and continues to pursue it, is blessed. Verse 25. The new covenant is perfect, because it derives from the perfect God. Also is perfect in that it contains the permanent remedy for forgiveness, which the old covenant, having only animal blood, did not. And he gives Hebrews 7:19, Hebrews 9:9 references to that about the blood of bulls and goats and so forth can't take away sin. But of course, the new law does with the death of his son. James now addresses the nature of genuine religion versus bogus religion. If anyone congratulates himself with a self-perceived grandeur, while at the same time he cannot control his own tongue, he's self-deceived, and his religion is utterly worthless. Verse 26. Pure religion, one that is undefiled in God's sight, consists of two things. The two items mentioned do not constitute an exhaustive list, but they're representative of two major areas of concern. There must be an interest in others, especially would this be true of the most vulnerable in society, namely widows and orphans and their affliction. These represent those who have not the means to care for themselves. A second obligation is personal purity. This involves avoiding the filthy influences of an amoral world, one overflowing with selfish and sensual pleasures, which contaminate both internally and externally. Religiosity, baptized in covetousness and worldly filth, is one of the most pathetic sights of society. This is Jackson's comment about that. In other words, somebody that appears to be religious, or he seems to say the right things and so forth and so on. He puts himself up as somebody that's pious, somebody that's a Christian, and so forth. And but he doesn't take care of the widows and orphans. He really cares nothing about the downtrodden or outcast of society, those that's having a tough time. Nor does he control his tongue. And so what he's saying is that you can have a lot of good characteristics, a lot of wonderful attributes, but in this one thing you fail. Then, Lord, as we get into chapter 2, down about that, whosoever keeps the whole law and offends at one point is guilty of all. You and I have talked about that, and you mentioned one time about how frightening that verse is, or how, I can't remember just how you put it, but kind of a sobering thought when you get to thinking about it, that you do all these things, right, and yet you come up short in this one area. This particular one he's talking about is the tongue, and the fact that we can't control what we say. He had already discussed, be swift to hear, slow to wrath. Slow to speak, slow to wrath. He's already addressed that issue. So what he's saying is that's part of being a Christian. That's part of being religious. That's part of what pure religion is. That's part of what true religion is. Not just an outward show, but it's very important. What he's saying here is very important to control the tongue. And if we have all these other good characteristics, and he's going to talk about this later on when he's talking about the something that we were talking about there a minute ago, Lloyd, James chapter 2 and verse 10, where he's talking about whosoever keeps the whole law and offends at one point, he is guilty of all. In other words, what he's saying is, even in that situation, he can't say, well, I've done all these good things, and that counteracts this bad thing. In other words, you got a guy, and when you look at it at first glance, you say, well, boy, that is a hard thing to do. But it's kind of like, and Barnes and others gives some great examples about this. You got this guy that does a lot of good things. He's a good father. He's a good husband. He's a good citizen. He pays his debts and so forth. But he lets himself get out of control, and he goes out and kills somebody. The fact that he kills somebody, all these other things that he's done doesn't counteract. It doesn't cancel what he did in this other situation. And he's going to get into that. But he's kind of leading into that a little bit here about this one thing about you're religious, you do all these other things, but you can't control your tongue. And he's going to have quite a discussion about that, of course, in James chapter 3, about the tongue that we'll get into later on. Go ahead, Ezra. Got a thought?
Yes, sir. I had the idea before I became a Christian that, as long as my good works outdid my bad ones,
There you go.
then I'd be okay.
Yeah.
I would have. Of course, that's an earning salvation way of looking
Philosophy,
at it.
yeah.
But that was just it. I'm not as bad as I am good.
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of people say, well, I'm not as bad as somebody else, I do a lot better than he does. Well, that's not the standard.
People just, it seems to me, now I could be wrong, but people just seem to think I'm basically a good person, therefore I'm going to heaven.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, people look at it. As a matter of fact, he's going to talk about that, about appearance here in the next chapter, when he's talking about this poor man comes in shabby clothes and everything, and how we look at things as opposed to how God looks at things. We see this person coming in, and this wealthy guy comes in, and he's dressed appropriately, and he drives up in a nice automobile, and all these kind of things. And so we say, well, you sit here in this place of honor, and this other guy comes in, shabby clothes and so forth. Well, you stand over here, kind of thing. So, and that does happen. And so what he's contrasting that about and in that particular case, that was the one thing that he's talking about. You keep the whole law, and yet in this matter of being partial or prejudiced against somebody because of the way they look, or because of their lack of wealth and so forth and so on, he said, you violate the law, basically is what he's saying.
We're guilty of that a lot without even realizing it.
Yeah.
I mean, the church
Yep.
code is guilty. There's people guilty everywhere. If somebody come in here that's not dressed too well and
Yep.
maybe the clothes a little bit dirty.
There you go.
If somebody's dressed real well, everybody's gonna speak to them, talk to them real nice.
There you go.
They won't say a word to that person.
I know.
It's just subconsciously.
Yeah.
Not really intending to do anything bad, you're just waiting.
That's right, that's right, exactly right. And when he gets into that, he's going to have quite a discussion about that, and we'll get into that about the partiality and the way that they were doing things. But when he's looking into that perfect law of liberty, as I mentioned earlier, Barnes says this: the word means to stoop down near by anything, to bend forward near, so as to look at anything more closely. So this guy in verse 25, when he looks into the perfect law of liberty, it's more than just a glance. He really looks and wants to know what he needs to do better. He's seeking to correct things in his life that needs to be corrected. So he attentively looks at that. And so what he's saying is that the object is to show that if a man would attentively, conscientiously look into and continue in that, and that's what he's saying, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work. You know, this man continues to do what needs to be done. So the emphasis here is not on the manner of looking, but in the manner of staying with it. It's kind of like Jesus said, "If you continue in my words, then are you my disciples." In other words, if you love me, keep my commandments, and all the other things that pertain to something like that. So it's a continuation. It's a continuation of observing the law, of continuing or persevering in the law. And then, of course, the perfect law of liberty, refers to the gospel and the New Testament, as it were. That's called the perfect law, and continues therein. So he doesn't merely look at it, but he stays with it. He said, "This is the man that's going to be blessed in his deed." There's a statement in Psalms 19, verse 11, that's similar to this, where it says, "In keeping of them, in keeping of his commandments or his statutes, his judgments, there is great reward." And it's kind of similar to what he's saying here. This man should be blessed in his deed. And Psalm 19:11 says something very similar. In keeping of them, in keeping of the commandments, there is great reward. And then in verse 26, just 2 or 3 thoughts about that. Talks about seeming to be religious, talking about being pious or devout, but he doesn't restrain his tongue, as we mentioned earlier. In other words, even if that's the one thing that we can't control, he's saying that basically all the appearance and even all these other things that we might have done that's good, you know, we can chalk them up, kind of like Israel was talking about a while ago. We can mark them down. I do this good, I do this good, you know, one right after another. But I spout off, I say things that I shouldn't say. In James chapter 3, and we'll get into that later, as I mentioned, but it really says a lot about that. You know, you out of the same mouth proceed blessing and curse, and these things ought not to be so, and all the things that he mentions there. So he's saying that if we have an inclination to use the tongue not in the right way, then all these other things, it's as if it cancels out all these other things, basically. He says, your religion is vain, it's empty, it's void. Notice what he says, if any among you seem to be religious, okay, he does a lot of really good things, and bridleth not his tongue, he deceiveth his own heart. In other words, he thinks he's really a good fellow, he thinks he's on the right track, but what does he say about his worship, his religion, his relationship with God? He said, it's vain, it's worthless, it's empty. So all of these things, what he's saying is, that one thing, Lord, back to James chapter 2 and verse 10, and we'll get into that more later, that one thing then basically it neutralizes all the other things. It's like it cancels them out, as it were.
kind of like the rich young ruler that came to Christ and
Yep.
that's the way he must do to be saved.
There you go.
He kept all the commandments from his youth up.
Yep, I've done all these
There's
things.
only one thing that kept him from
One thing.
selling what he had.
Yep, excellent example, excellent example. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about where he wasn't willing to give up his love of money, whatever it was that Jesus saw in his heart. He knew that he needed to get rid of this one thing, and he was not willing to get rid of that one thing. He loved money. It's kind of like the Pharisees and Sadducees so often. They said that they said they loved God and so forth and so on, but they wouldn't confess. They wouldn't confess his son, because they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. They thought they might be put out of the synagogue if they did. So they wouldn't confess him. So that one thing, what he's saying is that we can't say, well, I've done all these wonderful things, so I can't give up this one bad thing, but that's okay because I've done all these other things, and it cancels out or negates this bad thing, and God's just going to say anyway, like Israel was saying, when you balance the scales that way, all these good outweigh this one thing that is really bad in my life. And basically what he's saying is, no, it doesn't. It doesn't do that. Go ahead.
It seems also from the text we learned that true religion is not convenient. I
Yeah,
mean, it's we have to sacrifice to do these things. We have to sacrifice, especially visiting the fatherless and the widows,
Yeah.
and to go and do things there that the congregation needs. It's never convenient.
never convenient, is it?
Depending on how we look at it.
Yeah.
No, but, and that's, of course, I know the theme of the book is doing things,
Yeah.
not just talking about it or just believing alone.
Yeah,
But yes, sir.
yeah,
Can't
absolutely,
have it accidentally, can we?
absolutely,
No, sir.
absolutely. Takes work, and so a lot of people look at that one thing as not being so bad. Well, like I say, well, I'm a lot better than somebody else. Well, that's not so bad. A lot of other people are killing people and committing adultery and fornication. I don't do any of that, so I'm a pretty good Joe, But what he's saying is, if the tongue is not subdued, that it will show that we haven't brought ourselves into the subjection of God's law as he tells us to do, because he says that we've got to control the tongue, and if we don't control the tongue, then all these other things we do, he said, is vain, it's empty, it's worthless. So then, pure religion, he defines pure religion in verse 27, and I just read Barnes' comment about it. He said the phrase pure religion means that which is genuine and sincere, or which is free from any improper mixture. In other words, and he says pure religion and undefiled. In other words, if it's pure, it is undefiled. Undefiled before God and the Father is this. And so he defines it. Now, what he says here is not an exhaustive list of things that constitute pure religion. But what he does is he kind of boils it down. It's kind of like Jesus said, love God and love your fellow man. On these two laws hang all the law and the prophets. It doesn't negate all the other things. We said before that there are something like 54 commands in James. Well, Jesus boiled all those down, those 54 and others, to two. And what he does here, he boils down pure religion to two things. You look after other people, you care about other people, that's important, care about other people, and you've got to have a pure life. You got to take care of yourself. In God's sight, the purity of living right and do right. You've got to live right and do right, and part of that is looking after others who aren't as fortunate as you, and they need help. So what he's saying is that pure religion will lead to a life of practical benevolence. In other words, we care about those that can't help themselves, and we'll keep ourselves unspotted from the world. Matter of fact, in is it 1 Thessalonians 5:22, abstain from the appearance of evil? Is that 1
Yes.
Thessalonians 5:17 or 5:22?
Yeah, it is.
5:22.
It's 5:22.
So what it's saying is, even in keeping ourselves unspotted from the world, then as Joel quotes a lot of times, 1 John 2:15-17, love not the world, neither things in the world, all that's in the world, love the flesh, love the, all those things is not of the Father, but is of the world. So those, it's important for us to live right, get rid of all the impurities in our life, and to live right. So we've got to keep our bodies. God said, "Be ye holy, for I'm holy." So all of those things play into that. And of course, to visit the fatherless and widows, that means to go see after them, to help take care of them. And as Lord said a while ago, when we get in James chapter 2, those last 13 or 14 verses, it's not just, as he said, be ye warmed and filled, notwithstanding, you don't give them the things that they need, what good did it do, kind of thing. So we'll get into that later on, but he's kind of setting a predicate for some of that as to what that actually means. So, and God, of course, if we want to imitate God and want to imitate His Son, one of the statements in Psalm 68:5 says, "He is a father of the fatherless and a judge of the widows in His holy habitation." So if we want to be like God or like His Son, then we take care of those that need to be taken care of, and then we have the wherewithal to keep ourselves pure and so forth. We're a friend of the widow, we're a friend of the fatherless, and when we do that, if we're willing to do that, they can call us most anything, because if you go out of your way to help those that need the help, then you're pretty much going to be relied on to do any other thing that needs to be done, as the Lord was saying. So this, the religion that we need to have then is to take care of others, and then for ourselves to be uncontaminated, or to be pure, and to be as much like God's Son as possible. And that would show that we're Christian. It's not just we're not a fly-by-night thing. We don't saying that we're Christian and not a Christian, but what he's saying is these two things will show evidence that we're living right and doing right, and being that Christian, rather than being vain in our religion or vain in our worship. Charlie, you have a thought?
It's all about good and bad. In 1 Kings 3:9 it says, "Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad, for who is able to judge this thy so great a people?"
It sounds like Solomon. That's Solomon?
Yes, sir.
Good thought. Absolutely. He wanted wisdom so that he would know how to handle the affairs of the people, his subjects, the people underneath him, as the king of Israel. Absolutely. Any thoughts before we get into chapter 2? Anybody? Y'all jump in if you have something to express.
Coach, one verse that would be along the same lines we know very well is when Jesus says, "This people draweth nigh unto me with their mouth and honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me."
Absolutely.
That's
Absolutely.
the one that's the opposite of
Fits in right there.
Yes, sir.
Fits with that. That's right. So we say that we're Christian, we say all of the right things, but in reality, there's something amiss that, and in that sense, I don't know if in that particular case, but in a lot of other cases similar to that, he called them hypocrites, right? In other words,
That's exactly right.
you appear to be righteous and so forth and so on, but there are things in your life that you need to clean up. And
White as temperature, is that way?
yeah,
It looks pretty outside, but it's full of dead men's bones.
absolutely. All right, chapter 2. Let's read the first 4 verses, and then we'll have some make some comments. Keith, if you read, go ahead and read the first 4 verses, if you would, and then we'll go back and make some observations of it.
My brethren, have not the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with respect to persons. For if there come into your assembly a man with a gold ring and goodly apparel, and there come in also a poor man in vile raiment, and ye have respect to him that weareth the gay clothing, and say unto him, Sit thou here in a good place, and say to the poor, Stand thou there, or sit here under my footstool. Are ye not then partial in yourselves, and are become judges of evil thoughts?
Okay. So he's saying that if we're saying that we're following Jesus Christ, that's not the way Jesus Christ would have operated, basically is what he's saying. It looks like when he's phrasing that, he's saying don't have the faith of the Lord Jesus Christ. But what he's saying is that you don't have the faith of the Lord Jesus Christ when you have respect to persons, because Jesus Christ didn't operate that way. As a matter of fact, he's going to go on to talk about how that the poor were the ones that hurt him and so forth, as opposed to the rich. So he's talking about the faith being a distinguishing characteristic of the Christian religion, and of course faith is one of the things by which we are justified. But what he's saying here is, don't hold such views of the religion of Christ as to lead you to manifest partiality to others, because this is not the way Jesus would have operated. In other words, he didn't look at people based on their rank or based on their financial status or based on their skin color, based on the gender or whatever. He didn't look at them that way. And he's described here as the Lord of glory, means glorious himself, basically is what he's saying. He was encompassed with glory. And that respect to persons, again, shows partiality because of somebody's rank or their wealth or what they're wearing, the kind of car that they're driving or whatever. And then, so he's talking about the assembly, and he mentions coming into your assembly. Of course, back in that day, when in the early part of time, in the early part of Christianity, they might have been worshiping in synagogues, but the assembly for us would be, of course, the church assembly, the assembling of ourselves together, and so forth. So that's the way that we would understand it. He's talking about coming to the assembly where everybody is gathered together. And he says, a man comes in with a gold ring, which in that day would probably have been indicative of some type of rank or class, or somebody with money and so forth. And it could be the same way today. Somebody that comes in with a Georgia National Championship ring, Bill, and say, well, where would you like to sit? No, I'm just kidding.
You didn't give him a seat. Charlie has
Yeah, no comment, but Charlie will know. So the rings in that day probably were indicative of some type of ornament of the rich. Today it could be an automobile, it could be the kind of clothing we wear, or it could be the title of the person. The governor comes in, or
The signal.
or shall I say President Biden comes in, and we make sure that things are going good for them, or this person in goodly apparel, rich in splendid dress and so forth. And then the poor man, he contrasts that with the poor man. He said the Greek term here means vile raiment, filthy or foul, sordid, shabby, this sort of thing, and comes into the public worship, and he's probably talking about not those who normally are there, but he's talking about somebody dropping in. He's talking about somebody that's not a member of the congregation. Somebody comes in from the outside, contrasting how you view this wealthy person, dressed nice and everything, as opposed to a person that comes into your assembly, is visiting, like Lloyd said, of how you treat that person as opposed to the wealth. And so that's probably what he's referring to here. And he's talking about you have respect to the one that wears the gay clothing or the way he's dressed and so forth. In verse 3, you treat him with respect and so forth, without knowing anything about him, but you show respect to him, not knowing anything about his lifestyle. And the poor man, you don't know anything about him, but there could be a vast difference in the moral character of these two people, basically is what he's saying. And he's going to talk about that here in just a minute. So, just the indication is this wealthy guy comes in, dressed appropriate and everything, so you automatically put him in a place of honor. Could be near the pulpit or some other elevated place where he would be conspicuous, that the governor's here or the senator's here or whatever it may be. And then, but you kind of put this poor man out where nobody notices him, and that's kind of the contrast that he's given here. That this person is not worth the least attention that you give him, but this person that is nicely dressed or higher up is. And he says, as a result of that, in verse 4, aren't you partial then in yourselves or among yourselves? Don't you know that you are showing partiality? And he said, he goes on to say, aren't you judges of evil thoughts? Albert Barnes says that there's been a lot of difference of opinion respecting this passage, but here's the way he sums it up. He says, yet the sense seems not to be difficult. There are two ideas in it. One is that they showed by their conduct that they took it upon themselves to be judges, to pronounce on the character of men who were strangers and on their claims to respect. The other is that in doing this, they were not guided by just rules, but they did it under the influence of improper thoughts. They did it not from benevolence, not from a desire to do justice to all according to their moral character, but from the improper feeling which leads us to show honor to men on account of their external appearance rather than their real worth. So I think that's a pretty good summary of that. You could go back to Matthew 7 verse 1. What did Jesus say? Judge not.
What you mean not judge?
And you're going to be judged by the same standard that you judge others. He's going to have mercy. He won't have. He will have mercy. That somebody that shows mercy. He's not going to have mercy to somebody that doesn't show mercy. And then there's another statement in John 7:24 that's very similar. Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. Right, Israel? So what he's saying is that you've made a judgment, an improper judgment, because you know nothing about these two strangers that came into your assembly, and yet you formed an opinion about them based on the way they look. And that's basically what he's talking about here, I think. Their real worth may be totally different. And so what he's saying is that you're wrong to, first of all, you're wrong to judge the strangers at all, but if you're going to judge them, judge righteous judgment, and make sure you know something about them before you form a judgment or pass that judgment on. And you certainly don't do it just on first appearance. Or you look at them and say, well, this one, I'm going to treat him nice and right and so forth. But this one, no, just based on the way that he looks. Charlie, go ahead.
All right, 1 Thessalonians 5:14 says, now we exhort you, brother, warn them that are unruly, comfort the feeble-minded, support the weak, be patient toward all men.
Absolutely, that's a good summation of what we're talking about here, isn't it? Absolutely, treating people the right way, treating them right. Barnes had this comment. He said, he kind of sums it up this way in verse 4. He said, the sense is that we have no right to form a decisive judgment of men on their first appearance, as we do when we treat one with respect and the other not. And that when we make up our opinion in regard to them, it should be by some other means of judging than the question whether they can wear gold rings and dress well. So it can't be just a first appearance kind of thing. You know, it takes some time. If you're going to make a judgment at all, make sure it's the right judgment, make sure it's based on the way that they are, the kind of person they are, rather than the way that they appear to be, perhaps. All right, any thoughts before we go into verse 5?
It's an old saying that you don't have a second chance to make a good first impression. So it's important to always try to remember that.
Absolutely.
Meet someone new or meet someone differently. Your first impression is the one they get when they first meet you.
Absolutely. Exactly right, Bill. Good point. Excellent point. So what he's saying, hearken or listen to what I've got to say in verse 5. He calls them his beloved brethren. Said, so he proceeds to show that the rich had no special claim on their favor, and that the poor, in fact, might be more entitled to esteem or respect than those that are rich. And so he's going to delve into that a little bit, because he said, look at the poor. Hath not God chosen the poor of this world rich in faith? You go back to Jesus on earth. Who was it that the Bible said heard him gladly?
Common people.
The common people. The common people heard him gladly. What about the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the higher up, the chief priests and so forth and so on? Not so much, right? So what he's saying here is that the poor, hadn't God chosen the poor of the world rich in faith? Those are the ones that might be more likely to come to him than the rich. The Lord gave the example of the rich man there, a rich young ruler there a little bit ago. So that may be, and what did Jesus say about how hard it was for the rich to go to heaven? Very difficult. Very difficult. Not because of their riches necessarily. God is no respecter of persons. So God can save the rich just as much as the poor. And we have many examples of wealthy in the Bible. You know, Solomon and Abraham and many others. Job at one time, and a lot of others. But what he's saying here is that the poor, as far as the world is concerned, they're kind of the outcasts. But God looks at them differently. He doesn't see things the way we see things a lot of times. His ways and thoughts are different from my ways and thoughts. You know, Isaiah and others have expressed that same kind of statement. So he says that in a sense, God has a special reference in choosing those who should be his children. The meaning is not that he's not willing to save the rich as the poor, where he has no partiality, but the fact that the poor may be more receptive to hearing it, and they're the ones that heard him gladly. And then rich in faith, though they may be poor in this world's goods, they're rich in a higher and more important sense. They have faith in God, and this world with all the problems and everything, those are the things that count, and the only thing that ultimately is going to count. And so much so that they're heirs of the kingdom. So he mentions that they're the ones that's going to inherit eternal life. And then he starts talking about that you've despised the poor. But then he's going to get into how were you treated by the rich. In other words, this person that you elevate or put in a place of prominence in the assembly, how have these people treated you in the past? You know, he has quite a statement about that. He said, you've despised the poor. And it's one person said it's almost like asking a question, do you despise the poor? In other words, do you despise the poor? You despise the poor, do you, and are disposed to honor the rich? He said then, look then, this is what Barnes says, look then and see how the rich treats you, and see whether you have so much occasion to regard them with any particular respect. And then he goes on to say, why you should not elevate them, or why you should not think highly of them. Don't they oppress you? And let me just read, Barnes had a comment on this I thought was pretty good. The meaning is not that they oppress the poor as such, but that they oppress those whom James addressed. It is probable that then, as since a considerable portion of those who were Christians were in fact poor, and that this would have all the force of a personal appeal, but still the particular thought is that it was a characteristic of the rich and the great, whom they were disposed to honor, to oppress and crush the poor. What about today in our society? Those that are in higher authority and so forth, how do they look at the poor? They care nothing about you except if they can get your vote.
They're entitled.
They're entitled.
They're
Yeah.
the rich they are entitled, that everything is
Absolutely.
owed to them.
Absolutely. It's owed them. Right. It's owed them. They have this elevated status, and they look down their noses at the poor or those that have a tough time. And let's just be honest about it. It is. I mean, it's in every age it's been that way. And this is what he's saying. He says, don't the rich oppress you, and don't they draw you before the judgment seats? Who are the ones that so often, not all the time of course, but who's the ones that get off things? They hire the best lawyers and they get off, and the poor can't afford anybody except who the judge gives them, I guess, the friend of the court or whatever. But what he's saying is that the rich people oppress you, they put you down, and yet you elevate them rather than somebody else that's in the same boat that you're in. And he's saying that is a bad thing. So let me just read this one statement. It says, that is, they're your persecutors rather than your friends. And when you treat them as a friend, and here they are oppressing you and persecuting you. He said it was undoubtedly the case that many of the rich were engaged in persecuting Christians, and that on various pretenses they dragged them before the judicial tribunals. The same kind of thing happens today. Look at all those people on January the 6th. What's happened to them? Well, I think you know what I'm talking about. But back where we going to overthrow the government, the people walking in the Capitol going to overthrow the government, and some of them in jail for 20 years or whatever. It's just very unfortunate. But what he's saying is this is the way that it is in society. It hadn't changed in 2,000 years very much, has it, in that regard? Thank you, guys. Appreciate your good attention.